Welcome everybody to this virtual tour of the birthplace of Bromley's most famous son, H.G. Wells. We will hear in his own words about his early life, his impressions of the town and his experiences. And we'll also visit the various places he describes so vividly in his memoirs. H.G. is Herbert George, but his mother called him Bertie, so we'll call him Bertie as well. Your hosts are members of Bromley Civic Society. I'm Tony Banfield, chairman of the society, and telling the story in Bertie's own words are Jane Secker, Kerry Hood and Peter Martin. To set the scene, we'll show many old photographs of the town as Bertie would have known it, and which we compare with what still survives of Old Bromley today. Firstly, a word about Bromley Civic Society. The society was originally a residents group which was fighting the very serious demolition of the heritage of the town centre, and this was in the 1980s. We involved all of the main heritage groups, Save Britain's Heritage, the Victorian Society, the Georgian group, and eventually, after a great deal of trouble, managed to get most of the town designated as a conservation area. So everything you see today will be in the protected zone. That said, it's always an uphill struggle to save anything even with that protection, but without it there wouldn't be anything left, frankly, to show you today. Now, we've done this walk many times for members of the public, but the present COVID situation has obviously made us think we've got to find other ways, and so we're exploring the virtual world, and we're very lucky to have a professional filmmaker, Mihai Andre, to act as our director and filmmaker, and also he's a local resident, which makes it much more appropriate.
Bertie was born in Bromley in 1866, and he lived here for the first 13 years of his life until 1879, when the family moved away for reasons which will be revealed. His early childhood coincided with a time of great change in Bromley. The railway came to Bromley South at 1858, and then when Bertie was 4, to Bromley North in 1870. In his memoir, he describes the rapidly changing Bromley that he witnessed in the first 13 years of his life. The place, which had hardly been more than a few big houses, a little marketplace and a straggling high street upon the high road, with 2 coaching inns and a superabundance of small pull-up beer houses, was stimulated to a vigorous growth in population. Steadily, London drew it closer and suburbanised it. No one foresaw this growth, except for a few speculative jerry builders. Slum conditions appeared almost at once in courts and muddy byways, yet all around were open fields and common land. Bromley Common, Chislehurst Common, the great parks at Sundridge Park and Camden Park, and to the south, wide heathery spaces around Keston fish ponds and Down. This transformation from a rural market town into a Victorian suburb for Bertie was a brutal and traumatising experience, and it caused him in later life to describe Bromley as a suburb of the damnedest. His disaffection never left him, and when as a famous writer he was offered the freedom of Bromley, he rejected it quite contemptuously, in my opinion.
Before I start, just let me say this: I'm not dressed as Bertie. Bertie was a socialist. He hated top hats and things like this. He was the modern man of his time. Let me say, he was born in 1866 and number 47 the High Street, just here. And in his own words, describing the place where he was born, the house in which this little boy ran about, clattering up and down the uncarpeted stairs, bawling, was one of a row of badly built houses upon a narrow section of the high street. In front, upon the ground floor, was the shop filled with crockery, china, glassware and a special line of goods, cricket bats, balls, stumps, nets and other cricket material, because his father was a professional cricketer. It was called Atlas House because of a figure of Atlas bearing a lamp instead of the world in the shop window. He describes a murderously narrow staircase with a twist in it led downstairs from the shop to a completely subterranean kitchen lit by a window which derived its light from a grating on the street level. The room was dark and intermittently darker because of the skirts and feet going by over the grating. So they spent most of their time down there. There was a boundary wall separating us from the much larger yard and sheds of Mr. Covell the butcher, in which pigs, sheep and horned cattle were harboured violently and protested plaintively through the night before they were slaughtered. Some were recalcitrant and had to be treated accordingly. There was an element of rodeo about Covell's yard. On one side of the yard was Mr. Monday, the haberdasher, who had put up a greenhouse, and on the other, Mr. Cooper, the tailor, had built out a workroom in which 2 or 3 tailors sat and sewed. The unbricked part of our yard had a flower bed in which my father had planted a bush of weigela. It flowered reluctantly, and most things grew reluctantly in that bed. A fact still vividly clear in my mind across an interval of 60 years is that it was the only patch of turned up earth accessible to the cats of Mr. Monday and Mr. Cooper and our own menage. But my father was a gardener of some resolution, and against the back of the house, rooting in a hole in the brickwork, he had persuaded a grapevine not only to grow but to flourish. Now we'll hear more about this grapevine later on in the story. The house was infested with bugs. They harboured in the wooden bedsteads and lurked between the layers of wallpaper that peeled from the walls. Slain, they avenged themselves by a peculiar, penetrating, disagreeable smell that mingles in my earlier recollections with the more pervasive odour of paraffin with which my father carried on an inconclusive war against them. Almost every part of my home had its own distinctive smell. That was the material setting in which my life began.
Opposite Atlas House, which was over here, was the backside of a row of buildings where I am standing now, fronting the west side of Market Square. This was known as the Middle Row. What had been a narrow alley behind the Middle Row was widened in 1832 to ease the traffic congestion through the square. Initially known as a new cut, this became eventually part of the High Street, and the houses and shops were built on the west side, including what was to become Atlas House on this side. By the turn of the century, all these properties were taken over by Fred Medhurst, a draper with ambitions, which were fulfilled in the 1930s with a new department store on the site, now occupied by Primark. The Medhurst name is still proudly displayed high above the entrance. Looking further into Market Square, we see the town hall built in 1863, 3 years before Bertie was born, at the expense of the Lord of the Manor, Cole's child. He was a coal merchant who, in true Victorian ethos of social advancement, brought Bromley Palace from the Diocese of Rochester and all the manorial lands that went with it, and became the new Lord of the Manor. Thus ended 1,000 years of occupancy by successive bishops of Rochester at Bromley Palace. As a principal benefactor, he built the new town hall in Market Square, around which the Thursday market was arranged. The market dates back to a charter granted by King John to Bishop Gilbert de Glanville in 1205. Originally on a Tuesday, but changed in 1447 to its present day of Thursday. A condition being that if a market day is missed for whatever reason, then the charter becomes void. This almost came to pass in 1924 when the market day coincided with Christmas Day, when trading was not allowed. Special dispensation was given for a stall to be set up, and a token sale of a potato was transacted in front of the market inspector and policeman, thus keeping the charter alive as it is today. The middle row opposite Atlas House and the town hall were demolished in 1930 for the present mock Tudor building, which you see behind me, which is now locally listed. It is a fine example of the arts and crafts Old English style, which was to become the prototype of 1930s housing everywhere, not least in Bromley. Several of the original Art Deco shop fronts still survive, including that of the former Paynes the Jewellers, now occupied by Chisholm Hunter, who restored the beautiful public clock.
Buildings from the 1880s represent the growing ambition of the town and civic pride, and the ambition of its traders anxious to impress with their new buildings. The earliest is on the corner of Widmore Road. Built in 1883 by Herbert Collins, this draper, whose claim to fame was that he dispensed with the old method of credit and he took cash, which he claimed kept prices down. He also introduced the notion of window shopping with large, elegant glass plates that faced onto the square. And it was the local butchers who vied for first place. Most notable is Covell and Harris, their new 1883 premises on the site of the old one, which so blighted Bertie's childhood with its backyard slaughtering. This is now HSBC Bank, designed in the arts and crafts Queen Anne style, incorporating sculpted animals and figures to great effect. It is now Grade 2 listed. Comparison of the two buildings graphically illustrates the rapid change of fortune in the 1880s. Similarly, in the same year, another local butcher, Amos Borer, built Aberdeen buildings in the lower High Street in the French Empire style, with 8 shop units, one of which he retained, which proudly displayed by appointment of the Prince of Wales crest. The Wells family left Bromley in 1879, and sadly they only ever saw the negative effects of this development before the town acquired this new civic pride. Another notable building is that built by David Grieg, the grocery chain, built in 1912 in the arts and crafts neo-Baroque style.
Side of the square is the Darwin Tree of Life mural, commissioned by the council and exquisitely painted by the artist Bruce Williams in 2008. It replaced a mural by Brian Barnes commemorating H.G. Wells himself, and amusingly it featured one of the tripods from War of the Worlds standing astride the old brick town hall in Market Square, and also included the novelist Rebecca West, with whom he had a long-standing relationship, although it ended in acrimony. The newer Darwin mural does pay some homage to H.G. Wells, and his portrait is in the corner at the side. Charles Darwin died in 1882 when Bertie was 16. It is tempting to think they might have crossed paths. Bertie was later lectured by T.H. Huxley, affectionately known as Darwin's bulldog, at what is now Imperial College in 1884. The concept of evolution features in some of Bertie's novels, most notably The Time Machine. Beneath the mural is the new town pump, dating from 1863. It originally stood at the corner of the old brick town hall at the approximate site of Barclays Bank.
So this is Mrs. Nott's Dame School, which was the first school that Bertie attended in 1871. Bertie tells us in his autobiography, "My mother taught me the rudiments of learning. I learnt my alphabet from a big sheet of capital letters that she kept in the kitchen. I learnt 9 figures on the same sheet from her and to count up to 100. And the first word I wrote was butter, which I traced over handwriting against a pane on the window. I also began to read under her instructions. But then she felt that my education was straining for higher things, and I went off with my brother Freddie, who on no account was to let go of my hand, to a school in a room with an unqualified lady and her equally unqualified daughter, Mrs. Knott. It was close to the drill hall, where I learnt to say my tables of weights and measures, read words of 2 or more syllables, and pretend to do summing. It was incomprehensible fudging that was never explained to me, all on a slate."
Here we see the parish church of St Peter and St Paul. The church tower dates from around 1400 and is all that survived the bombing raid in 1941. The explanation for the curious kink in the road is that the original church occupied what is now the open space and garden. Bertie's sister was buried in the churchyard. Inside the rebuilt church is also the gravestone of Elizabeth Johnson, wife of the 18th century lexicographer Samuel Johnson. Apart from the original tower, some interesting fragments of the medieval church can be seen randomly embedded in outer walls of the new building, most notably 2 medieval green man faces with their unmistakable foliage eyebrows and beards. From the 13th century, churches were encouraged to incorporate some pagan imagery on the basis, if you can't beat them, join them. Opposite the church is Kingston Cottages, built in the 1870s, which Bertie would have known and probably considered as some of the jerry-built housing he deplored. Some much older, picturesque houses next door were swept away in the 1960s building boom for the present St Paul's Square estate. Opposite is the former entrance to Church House, the grounds of which are now public ornamental gardens. The historic house, which Bertie would also have known, was sadly destroyed in the 1941 bombing raid, along with the church.
Now we move on to Martin's Hill, which is a miraculous fragment of the open countryside which Bertie knew and loved so well. The engraving, made in the year of his birth, shows the hill as a favourite picnic spot. It is recorded that when the first train left for London from what is now Shortland Station, down in the valley, the whole town turned out to see it off. Martin's Hill is also the last place where we can see colonies of the broom, the once prolific broom scrub, from which the town takes its name. The name Bromley comes from the Anglo-Saxon word Bromleyag, which literally means broom meadow. Bertie describes wandering out here by himself as a 6-year-old and imagining great battles taking place just here. He says, Martin's Hill indeed is one of the great battlegrounds of history. Scores of times the enemy skirmishers have come across those levels, followed by the successive waves of the infantry attack, while I, outnumbered 5 to 1, manoeuvred my guns around. The guns I'd refrained so grimly from using too soon, in spite of the threat to my centre, to enfilade them. Suddenly, from the curving slopes towards Beckenham, crash came the first shell, and then crash and crash. They were mown down by the thousand. They straggled up the steep slopes, wavering. Then came the shattering counter-attack, and I and my cavalry swept the broken masses away towards Croydon, pressed them ruthlessly through a night of slaughter onto the pitiful surrender of the remnant at dawn by Keston fish ponds. He obviously had a great imagination. And there were real battles as well with the boys from the National School. Bertie went to Morley's Academy, a private school in the High Street for boys between 7 and 15. He says there was a continual bickering between us and the boys of the National School. Bickering which rose occasionally to the level of a pitched battle with staves and sticks upon Martin's Hill, at that time a waste and now a trim recreation ground. For some unknown reason we were called Morley's Bulldogs, and at the elementary school boys were called, by us at any rate, Bromley Water Rats and Cads.
When Bertie was 12 years old, there came the shock news that his beloved Martin's Hill was up for sale as building land for more large Victorian villas that were being constructed following the coming of the railway. The townsfolk were outraged, and a famous anonymous verse appeared in the local press reading, "On this the people's piece of land, may the builder never ply his skill, may never his innovating hand deprive the town of Martin's Hill." In an early example of crowdfunding, the town raised £2,000 and persuaded the church commissioners to drop their asking price from £4,000. The hill was saved, and in 1878 became the first public park in Bromley. The lower slopes and Queen's Mead were added in 1887, commemorating Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, as inscribed on the drinking fountain that's now on Queen's Mead.
In Bertie's time, this view would have been largely rural. Early 1870s Bromley had not yet been suburbanised, but was just starting. On the horizon there would have been the astonishing Crystal Palace. Relocated from Hyde Park in 1856, it would have been a familiar view to young Bertie. He would have just taken it for granted. But it was an amazing building and unique for its time. Compared with other large buildings of the age, cathedrals like Palace of Westminster, St Paul's, it was ultra-modern, made entirely of glass, which together with its contents represented the new world, a promising world of new technology. Now, he was a frequent visitor to the palace with his mother. He refers to the plaster casts of Greek statuary that were displayed there that gave him his first inklings of desire. The tall and lovely feminine figures, bare-armed, bare-necked, showing beautiful bare bosoms, revealing shining thighs, wearing garments that were a revelation in the age of flounces and crinolines. As an adult, Bertie's sexual infidelities with women were the subject of scandal. Maybe this all started at Crystal Palace with its sculptured beauties. There were also the dinosaurs on display in the park, and this may have shaped his views on evolution. Below Martin's Hill is Queen's Mead, now a public park. But in Bertie's time, just a small part of the rural scene through which the River Ravensbourne meandered and regularly flooded. We hear more about this part of the town in his novel, The New Machiavelli, where Bromley is called Bromstead and the Ravensbourne River, the Ravensbrook. Of the river, he says, "The Ravensbrook of my earlier memories was a beautiful stream. It came into my world out of a mysterious beyond, out of a garden, splashing brightly down a weir which had once been the weir of a mill. Above the weir and inaccessible there were bulrushes growing in splendid clumps, and beyond that pampas grass, yellow and crimson spikes of hollyhock and blue suggestions of wonderland. The Ravensbrook had been important to my imaginative life. That way had always been my first choice in all my walks with my mother, and its rapid swamping by the new urban growth made it indicative of all the other things that had happened just before my time or were still at less dramatic pace happening. I realised that building was the enemy. I began to understand why in every direction out of Bromstead one walked past scaffold poles into litter, why fragments of broken brick and cinder mingled in every path, and the significance of the universal notice boards, either white and new or a year old and torn and battered, promising sites, proffering houses to be sold or let, abusing and intimidating passers-by for fancied trespass and protecting rights of way. Now, that sounds like something out of a Bromley Society newsletter. To carry on, the mill Bertie refers to is recorded in the Domesday Book of 1087, which had been a corn mill, a paper mill, a felt making mill, and in its last days used for polishing concave and convex high-class decorative mirrors for the city firm of Messrs Fenton of the Strand, hence the name glass mill. It fell into disuse in 30 years before Bertie was born, but the weir and the mill pond are still here and are one of the most historic features in Bromley. Beside the mill pond is a typical 18th century Kentish weatherboarded cottage, which we were able to get Grade 2 listed some years ago. Bertie would have known the cottage on his walks with his mother, but also looking at old photos of the town in his day, one can see its rustic appearance typifies of most of the buildings he would have known in the town itself.
Moving back into the High Street, we come to the Grade 2 listed Royal Bell Hotel, which was built in 1898 and is a splendid example of late Victorian arts and crafts design by the architect Ernest Newton. This replaced the famous hostelry, which Bertie knew well, and which gets a mention in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth Bennet is staying at Rosings, a grand house Jane Austen suggests is near Westerham, and is asked by the imperious Lady Catherine de Bourgh, "Where will you change horses?" "Oh, Bromley, of course. If you mention my name at the bell, you will be attended to." Certainly Jane Austen knew the Royal Bell and would have changed horses to and from visits to her uncle in Sevenoaks and probably also her brother at Godmersham. Mrs Sutton, who ran the bell in Bertie's time, and her son were to play a key role in Bertie's life when he broke his leg on the White Hart cricket field, about which we will hear more later.
Here is the site of Mr Morley's Commercial Academy, which Bertie was taught at from the age of 7. About his mother's choice of school for 7-year-old Bertie, he says that there was a recognition for the need for a universal elementary education. Bromley was served by a national school, and that was all that the district possessed in the way of public education. It was the mere foundation of an education, and it saw children up to the age of 13 or 14 and no further. But side by side with that 19th century national school, under the Education Act, the old 18th century order was still carrying on in Bromley, just as it was carrying on in my mother's mind. Mr Morley's Academy was a fairly well-preserved specimen of one of these private schools. Mr Morley himself was bald, portly, spectacled man with a strawberry nose and ginger grey whiskers. He wore a top hat, an ample frock coat and a white tie, and expected us to make frequent use of the word sir. His schoolroom was a single room built over a scullery, and there were desks around the wall and in the corner of the room, and there was his desk and the great ink bottle from which the inkwells were replenished. There were piles of slate and the incessant cane with which he administered justice. He also hit us with his hands, anywhere, and with books and rulers and anything that came to hand. And in that way, he urged us along the path of learning that led, in the more successful instances, to jobs as clerks. But Bertie tells us, I believe his teaching, such as it was better than that of the crudely trained mechanical grant earners of the contemporary national school, which was the only local alternative, and that my mother's instinct was a sound one in sending me to Mr Morley's antiquated middle-class establishment. When I left school at the age of 13, I had certainly acquired the ability to use English with some precision and delicacy, even if my accent was a Cockney one. And I had quite a good mathematical apparatus, as most boys of the same age get at a public school nowadays.
Morley's was demolished along with the rest of this side of the road when it was widened in 1902. Much of the opposite side, however, remains as Bertie would have known it, including the house of two important local historians, Thomas Wilson and John Duncan, both of whom wrote and printed and published histories of Bromley from this shop in 1797 and 1815. Adjacent is the Star and Garter pub, which, like the Royal Bell, dates from 1898 in the arts and crafts Queen Anne style, replacing a very modest timber-built hostelry. Further along is the last surviving of the three original coaching inns, the Swan and Mitre. A mitre is a bishop's hat, and the pub name refers to the 1,000-year-old association of Bromley with the bishops of Rochester, residing at Bromley Palace on the other side of town. The swan in the name could have a number of origins, but more recently pub signs have identified the swan with the 19th century music hall star Marie Lloyd, whose decorative dressing room mirrors from the old Gaiety Theatre adorn the interior of the pub. And of course, there is also the inference of those old actress and a bishop jokes in there somewhere. The pub is what Bertie describes as a beer pull-up establishment catering for carters and tradesmen, as opposed to the more upper-class clientele of the Royal Bell. Opposite here is Bromley College, the jewel in the crown of Bromley, and the only Grade 1 listed building. It dates from 1670 and sits within beautiful landscape grounds. It was built as almshouses for the widows of clergy and still serves very much the same function as sheltered accommodation for retired clergy, both men and women. We move on now into College Slip, which is one of the few remaining medieval slips or passageways which penetrate the high street between buildings. Here is the 18th century seedsman's cottage, which served the field beyond, which was leased out by the college and known to be the second oldest working nursery in Greater London. It was finally closed in 1987 by the council, and College Green was created in its place. So here we are in the nursery field, which is now a public park, renamed College Green. And it's looked after by the Green Gym, which is a local volunteer group for gardening and exercise. In 2017, the green was remodelled by the council in collaboration with the Friends, which opened up historic views of Bromley College and reclaimed an ancient black mulberry tree which had been covered by undergrowth. It is one of 3 mulberry trees planted by the college here and in the college grounds in around 1720, and it still fruits in the summer. To celebrate the college and the nursery rhyme, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, the Friends created a circular flower bed around it, with plants known at the time the college was built in 1670. One of these, appropriately named Bishop's Hat, has leaves in the shape of a bishop's mitre.
This is the site of Bromley's National School, now, as you can see, occupied by the Methodist Church. In Bertie's biography, he reminisces about his school days and about how much his mother did not want to send him to that school. He said, "I was never to mix with common children. They might teach me naughty words." He went on to say about Bromley schools, "The locality had no public provision for technical education or the development of artistic or scientific ability whatsoever. Even that much of a general education had been achieved against considerable resistance. There was a strong objection in those days to the use of public funds for other people's children. I think it was a very lucky thing for me personally that I acquired this much class feeling."
The very young Bertie would have known the area around the National School as open fields. But by the time he was 11, he had to witness them being torn up for housing development as we see it today, to his great dismay. The area was being laid out as New Bromley, with the first commuter housing, 1870s to 1880s, and the first housing for the lower middle classes, e.g. for shop assistants working in the big department stores in central London. Many of the families here had lodgers and even live-in maids and servants, usually young girls and boys. The smaller houses were clustered in North and West Streets on the line of old footpaths with grand additions along Tweedy and Widmore roads and beyond. Further along in North Street, we can see the old stables and bakehouse that served the co-op in East Street. These were converted in 1938 for use as the Bromley Little Theatre, which is still going strong. On the corner of North and East Street is the Railway Tavern, built in 1879 for the brewery Nader and Collier, whose name is preserved in the brickwork on the north elevation. It is an earlier example of the arts and crafts style than the Star and Garter and features decorative faience tile work on the exterior. It has a labyrinth of rooms and bars on the ground floor, reflecting all the class divisions of the time. Opposite, we see Bromley North Station, built in 1928, replacing the old wooden building of 1870, which Bertie would have known. The present building is Grade 2 listed and a perfect example of a child's toy train station, complete with a green copper domed cupola complementing other similar domes on the nearby Town Hall, Old Library and former Magistrate Court.
Coming into East Street, we enter the main shopping area of New Bromley, which is very domestic and modest in scale, unlike the much grander buildings which were to follow in Market Square and the Lower High Street after Bertie had left Bromley. Of particular note is the former Drill Hall, now O'Neill's Pub. This was the town's first multi-purpose entertainment venue, built in 1872 when Bertie was just 6 years old. It opened with a concert where Sir Arthur Sullivan, of Gilbert and Sullivan fame no less, was the piano accompanist. It must have been a major event in the town, which the Wells family might well have attended. The hall was also used for banquets, exhibitions and balls, as well as doubling up as a drill hall for the 18th Kent Volunteer Rifles Brigade. The present use as a pub retains the original utilitarian open space aspect of the building, which is now locally listed. It was here that the unsuspecting recruits for the First World War assembled before being shipped off to the front. Many of their names are recorded on the beautiful war memorial erected on Martin's Hill in 1926. At the corner of East Street and Market Square, we find the former local board offices, the forerunner of the Urban District Council and the place where local democracy was first established in 1872. From the outside, it looks like a large house, but behind the bay window, a large meeting room extends the full depth of the building. So entering Queen's Gardens, with the roaring traffic of Kentish Way, it is hard to imagine the rural scene which the whole area presented in Bertie's time, and until recently, until 1987. Kentish Way was constructed along the line of Love Lane, an ancient footpath, which Bertie knew and which would have been used on those walks as a child with his mother. In Bertie's time, Queen's Gardens was known as the White Hart Cricket Field, taking its name from the White Hart Inn, an 18th century coaching inn, which backed onto here from the High Street, that was just over there, where the horses serving the coaching trade were grazed. The inn was the heart and soul of Bromley in Bertie's time and in living memory. It was cruelly demolished in 1964, despite it being listed. It was replaced by a much despised brutalist building by the architect Owen Luder, 20 years before our successful campaign to designate what's left of this historic town as a conservation area.
So, welcome to Queen's Gardens. It was set out as a park in 1897 when the Lord of the Manor, Cole's Child Jr., the first Baronet of Bromley Palace, donated the land to the town on the occasion of Queen Victoria's Jubilee and on condition that it was laid out as a public garden. Previously, it was land used as the town field just to the east of Market Square and formed part of the farmland belonging to Bromley Palace. which is now the Civic Centre. It stretched from the White Hart over to the High Street and all the way to Widmore Green, right over there. Cricket was played on the field here by members of Bromley Cricket Club. It was established in the early 19th century. Club members are pictured here on White Hart Field. In the earliest known photograph in 1867, which does not show H.G. Wells' father, Joseph Wells, who was nevertheless credited with reviving the fortunes of the club, along with the local policeman shown here seated with a bat. As we have said, Bertie's father was a professional cricket player, playing for West Kent Club from 1857 to 1869, and he bowled for the County of Kent in 1862 and 1863. On June the 26th, 1862, he clean bowled 4 Sussex batsmen in 4 successive balls, a feat not hitherto recorded in county cricket. Writing about his father, Bertie tells us, "I know very little about the realities of my father's life at this time. He had a kind of attractiveness for women. I think he was aware of it, but I do not know whether he ever went further along the line of unfaithfulness than a light flirtation. In Bromley, at any rate, I should certainly have learnt from my schoolfellows of any scandal or scandalous suspicion." He then goes on to tell us, "My mother used to accuse my father of neglecting the shop for cricket, but essentially it was through playing cricket that the finances of the shop was propped up for many years." Bertie tells us more about his father. He was never really interested in the crockery trade and sold little, I think, but jam pots and preserving jars to the gentlemen's houses round about, and occasional bedroom sets and tea sets, table glass and replacements. But he developed his youthful ability to play cricket, and that he had kept alive as a professional bowler and cricket instructor in the neighbourhood.
The cricket ground was quite significant in Bertie's life because it's where he suffered a broken leg, which was to shape his life quite monumentally. He writes, "My leg was broken for me when I was between 7 and 8, and I am alive today and writing this autobiography instead of being a worn out, dismissed and already dead shop assistant because my leg was broken." The agent of good fortune was young Sutton, the grown-up son of the landlord of the Bell, which we visited earlier. I was playing outside the scoring tent in the cricket field, and in all friendliness he picked me up and he tossed me in the air and he said, "Whose little kid are you?" And I wriggled and he missed his hold on me and I snapped my tibia across a tent peg. Bertie goes on to say, "For some weeks I found myself enthroned on the sofa in the parlour as the most important thing in the house, consuming unheard of jellies, fruits, brawn and chicken, sent with endless apologies on behalf of her son by Mrs. Sutton. And I could demand and have a fair chance of anything that came into my head, books, paper, pencils, toys, but particularly books." The autobiography tells us of many, many books that Bertie read during his recuperation and how through these books he travelled the world and he became inspired with his reading to write. But it was another broken leg, this time his father's, that was also significant at Bertie's life at a later point, and it ultimately led to the family leaving Bromley, as he tells us. Another almost as important event was the breaking of my father's leg in 1877, which made the dissolution of our home inevitable. He set himself to prune the grapevine one Sunday in October and resolved to make a job of it and get to the highest shoots. He poised a ladder on a bench and he came a cropper. We returned from church to find him lying in the yard, groaning, and our neighbours, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Monday, helped to carry him upstairs. He had a compound fracture of the thigh bone. And before the year was out, it was plain that my father was going to be heavily lame for the rest of his life. This was going to be the end of any serious cricket, any bowling to gentlemen, any school jobs as a pro, or the like for him. And the supplementary income was cut off by this accident, which also involved much expense in doctoring. The chronic insolvency of Atlas House became acute.
There seemed little option but for Bertie to leave Morley's Academy at the age of 13 in 1880. His mother decided that a Bromley shop was no longer a suitable soil in which to pop me in order to grow up the perfect draper. She did not like to send me away where there was no one to look after me, for she knew that there are dangers that waylay the young who are not supervised. So she found a hasty solution to her problem by sending me on trial with view of apprenticeship to Rogers and Denyer of Windsor, opposite the castle. Very nice. Now it was my turn to put the things away, put the books away, give up drawing and painting and every sort of free delight, to stop writing stories and imitations of Punch, give up all vain hopes and dreams and serve an employer.
So just to finish with an anecdote that we learnt from a member of the H.G. Wells Society, as we've heard about the departure from Bromley of H.G. Wells, and it was a consequence of his father's broken leg. However, we understand there's another story about how Bertie's father came to break his leg. And it was related to a point you made earlier, when you told us that he had a kind of attractiveness for women. And I think he was unaware of it, but I do not know if it ever went any further than a light flirtation. Anyway, the alternative story goes that in fact his father was surprised with a lady when Bertie and his mother returned from church, and it was his haste to escort her over the back wall that in fact led to his broken leg. But I suspect that is another story.
So there we have it. Our walk ends here, but for Bertie, of course, it was just a beginning. We've heard the story of his early years in Victorian Bromley, a story of 2 broken legs, infidelity, alleged, sexual awakenings, fights and battles, real and imagined.
We hope you've enjoyed the view of Bromley as H.G. Wells knew it, as well as appreciating some of the historic character of the town. Wartime bombing destroyed some key heritage buildings, but it was nothing compared to the havoc wrought by piecemeal and planned development in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. It is only due to the successful campaign by local people for a designation of a conservation area in 1987 that we have been able to save what is left of the character of Old Bromley. But it's an uphill struggle, so your support would be welcome. We normally pass the hat round at this point. Instead, look out for a Just Giving link at the end of the video or in the comments box if you're watching on a computer. We would appreciate a donation. You can also join Bromley Civic Society for £10 per household per year. Alternative, you can just join our mailing list and receive our regular newsletters. Thank you everyone for coming on our virtual walk. There will be more to come, so do keep in touch.